I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker today. We have Kim Damon-Randall, and she's the Director of NOAA Fisheries Office of Protected Resources. Prior to joining OPR, Kim was at the NOAA Fisheries Greater Atlantic Regional Council working on endangered species and the ESA and the Marine Mammal Protection Act in a variety of roles, including the Assistant Regional Administrator. So with that, Kim, I will hand it off to you.
Great, thanks, Shannon. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm excited to talk about the Endangered Species Act in its 50th anniversary year. And I'm going to be talking a little bit more about what the ESA has done and some of the challenges that confront us moving forward. So, Lindsay, can you advance to the next slide? So as I said, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how the ESA has been saving species from extinction for the last 50 years. Next slide, please. The ESA is a powerful legal framework that helps us to conserve and recover endangered and threatened species and their ecosystems, both here in the US and abroad. Some pretty interesting facts about the ESA are that we share responsibilities under the Act with the Fish and Wildlife Service. We, NIMS, protect over 160 species under the Act. Millions of acres of habitat have been designated as critical habitat for listed species. And as a result of that, federal agencies are required to ensure that the actions that they're carrying out are not likely to destroy or adversely modify those habitat areas. And fewer than 1% of species have been lost after protection under the ESA. Next slide, please. Several key things led up to the passage of the ESA. The first was the signing of the Lacey Act in 1900 to help prevent overhunting of game and bird species. And this was catalyzed by recognition of the last remaining passenger pigeon that you can see here on the slide. Her name was Martha, and she was named after Martha Washington. In 1962, Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, which brought environmental conservation into the public eye by calling out the negative impacts of pesticides. In 1966, President Johnson signed the Endangered Species Preservation Act, and he established the first list of endangered species. In 1972, President Nixon signed the Marine Mammal Protection Act into law with bipartisan support. And then in 1973, President Nixon signed the ESA into law. And also at that same time, 80 countries signed on to the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna or Flora, also known as CITES. Next slide, please. So you can see here in this slide, Richard Nixon is signing the ESA into law in December of 1973. And the bipartisan support that the Act had in 1973 really highlighted the fact that Congress recognized the importance of protecting species and their ecosystems. Next slide. The purpose of the ESA is to provide a means whereby the ecosystems upon which endangered and threatened species depend may be conserved. And the law created the policy that all federal departments and agencies shall conserve endangered and threatened species and shall utilize their authorities in furtherance of the purposes of this Act. Next slide. So NOAA has very specific goals related to the ESA, and those include conserving threatened and endangered species in their ecosystems, reducing threats so that species are able to recover to the point at which they no longer need the protections of the Act, and evaluate and authorize necessary activities that may affect listed species. And we accomplish these goals through implementing various sections of the ESA, which I'll describe briefly in the next slide. These key responsibilities under the Act include listing and critical habitat. So before a species can receive the protection provided by the ESA, it must first be added to the federal list of endangered and threatened wildlife and plants. A species is added to the list when we determine that it's met the definition of an endangered or threatened species under the Act. Species may also be removed from the list when they no longer require ESA protection, or we can downlist them when there's a change in status from an endangered species to a threatened species. The ESA requires that listing determinations be based solely on the best scientific and commercial information available. So we're not allowed to consider economic impacts when making listing determinations. The process by which we evaluate whether a species should be added or removed from the list or reclassified in status is commonly referred to as the listing process. Not very unique, but that is what we call it. Once a species is listed, NOAA Fisheries is required to determine whether there are areas that meet the definition of critical habitat, and then designate critical habitat based on the best available scientific data. Once a species is listed, we also have to think about what needs to be done to restore listed species and their ecosystems to the point where they no longer need ESA protection. Listed species may have different needs and may require different conservation strategies to achieve recovery. A primary role for the agency in recovering listed species is to set goals for each species recovery through the development of recovery plans. So NOAA Fisheries works with other federal agencies, states, tribes, and other stakeholders to recover listed species. Under Section 6 of the ESA, we provide assistance and grant funding to states to support conservation of listed species and also implementation of recovery plans. Grant funding through the Species Recovery Grants Program can be used to support management, research, and monitoring efforts that directly benefit the conservation of the species. Under Section 7 of the ESA, we consult with federal agencies to ensure that their actions don't jeopardize the continued existence of species or destroy or adversely modify critical habitat. Federal agencies can also carry out conservation efforts as part of their obligations under Section 7A1, sort of the more lesser known part of Section 7 of the ESA, as a means to minimize activities that adversely affect a species as part of an interagency consultation. Finally, states, local agencies, and private entities may conduct conservation actions to minimize or mitigate incidental take of a species as part of a conservation plan under Section 10 of the ESA. Next slide, please. NOAA Fisheries, as I said earlier, has jurisdiction over 163 endangered and threatened marine and anadromous species, including 65 foreign species. And the categories of animals that are covered include whales, dolphins and porpoises, seals and sea lions, sea turtles, fish and sharks, and other corals and invertebrates. Until last year, we did have one listed plant species, Johnson seagrass, but we actually removed the plant from the endangered species list based on information that we obtained for their genetics that demonstrate that Johnson seagrass is actually not a unique taxon, but it's actually a clone of an Indo-Pacific species. Next slide, please. So I'd like to share some important ESA milestones since this is the 50th anniversary year and we have accomplished a lot under the Act. In 1994, the Eastern North Pacific stock of gray whales was delisted. This was the first marine species to actually be delisted from the Act. The Caribbean monk seal was declared extinct in 2008 after last having been seen in 1952. So this was 21 years before the ESA was enacted. So a little bit too late for that species, unfortunately. But we were able to delist the eastern DPS of stellar sea lions in 2013. And the global status of humpback whales changed in 2016 after 9 distinct population segments were determined to no longer be threatened or endangered. Next slide, please. So a number of anthropogenic threats cause marine and anadromous species to be at risk, and they include things like bycatch. And you can see here in the photo at the top left, a totoaba with a vaquita at the man's feet. This is an example of how bycatch can lead to near extinction. The totoaba itself is listed as endangered. It's highly sought after for its swim bladder, but the vaquita, which is a small porpoise that's found in the same area as the totoaba, was caught as bycatch in the fishery and is now nearing extinction with only 10 to 13 animals left. Climate change is an ecosystem threat to all species, including us, yet not all species are being impacted or will be impacted similarly. Some species need more intervention or management actions than others. This challenges our management approaches now and in the future. Shifting oceanographic conditions as a result of climate change, which will likely increase in the future and are already affecting the distribution and health of many marine species. For instance, sea ice loss is negatively affecting ice-associated seals, which rely on sea ice and snow cover to support basic life functions, such as breeding, nursing and rearing pups, molting, and avoiding predators. Species have also shifted distribution as a result of climate change, and this puts them in areas where they can be subjected to new threats. An example of that is North Atlantic right whales that shifted their distribution into Canadian waters, likely as a result of climate change. And this put them at risk of entanglement and vessel strikes in an area that wasn't already managed for those things. Vessel strikes also pose a risk to many species. Collisions between boats of all sizes occur with various species of marine mammals, sea turtles, and fish. We currently use various regulatory and management options to reduce the risk of vessel strikes, and this is especially important in areas with heavy vessel traffic. We also educate vessel operators on responsible boating practices, and we're working to identify technological solutions to minimize the risk of vessel strikes of whales and other protected species, which I'll get into a little bit more in detail later. Overutilization is also a threat, and an example of that is Atlantic sturgeon that you can see pictured in the top right. They were once found in great abundance along the East Coast, but their populations have declined significantly due to overfishing and habitat loss. And today, all 5 U.S. Atlantic sturgeon distinct population segments are listed as endangered or threatened under the ESA. Habitat loss, degradation, and loss of access to important habitats also threaten marine and anadromous species. Habitats like wetlands are disappearing from coastal estuaries, and areas of floodplain wetlands are cut off from rivers by levees or are filled for development. This affects species like salmon and sturgeon who need to be able to access important habitats in freshwater, in estuaries, and in the ocean. Entanglements and marine debris are also of concern, and you can see an entangled whale in the photo in the middle. Entanglement in fishing gear and other lines in the water pose a significant risk to several large whale species and actually other protected species such as leatherback turtles. Marine debris can affect protected species as well, either through consumption or contamination. And pollution is another threat. You can see here a pod of dolphins swimming through the Deepwater Horizon oil slick. Non-point source pollution can also cause harmful algal blooms, which threaten many species. And some of you may be familiar with the ongoing domoic acid poisoning off the coast of California. This is from an harmful algal bloom, and it's leading to the death or illness of hundreds of California sea lions and dolphins. Next slide, please. So the ESA has achieved a lot over the 50 years that it's existed, but there are challenges. Oh, I just realized I'm on the wrong slide. Sorry. You might ask, given all of the things that are going on with the ESA and the challenges that we've talked about, what are we doing to try to help these species? And in 2015, we started a new initiative to bring greater attention and resources to save our most highly at-risk species. Of all the species that we have, the 163 that we have protected under the Act, under NOAA Fisheries jurisdiction, we consider 9 that are pictured here to be among the most at risk of extinction in the near future. The 9 species are Atlantic salmon, Cook Inlet beluga whale, Hawaiian monk seal, the Sacramento River winter run Chinook salmon, southern resident killer whale, Pacific leatherback turtle, Central California coast coho salmon, North Atlantic right whale, and white abalone. And we chose these 9 species because they're endangered. They're considered species whose extinction is almost certain in the immediate future because of rapid population decline or habitat destruction. And their survival conflicts with construction, development, or economic activity. And I wanted to highlight a few of our species in the spotlight. So we can go to the next slide. So the first one I was going to highlight is North Atlantic right whales. So the North Atlantic right whale is one of the world's most endangered large whale species. The latest preliminary estimate that we have suggests that there are fewer than 350 right whales remaining, and that includes only about 70 adult females. Some threats that they face include vessel strikes, entanglements, habitat degradation, and climate change. And there is an ongoing unusual mortality event, or UME, for this species, given that there's been a significant number of mortalities that have been occurring since 2017. So some of the actions that we're taking to recover the species include speed restrictions on vessels, with the hope that we will decrease the chances of lethal vessel strikes, and also exploring ropeless fishing gear options. And we are exploring some innovative technologies to try to address the threats to this species, including some systems to detect and avoid whales. Next slide, please. So next species I want to talk about was Atlantic salmon. Atlantic salmon actually used to range in the US throughout much of the Northeast from about Connecticut to Maine. They're now only present in Maine rivers, and the population continues to hover around only about 1,000 adults or less returning to Maine rivers to spawn in most years. There are several primary threats to Atlantic salmon in the US, which include dams and culverts that block or impede the migratory movements between freshwater spawning and rearing habitats, and the marine environment where they have to get to go out and feed and grow, habitat degradation, foreign fisheries, and poor marine survival. NOAA Fisheries is committed to working together with our federal, state, tribal, and NGO partners in the conservation and recovery of the endangered population in Maine. Our targeted management actions include improving connections between the ocean and freshwater habitats that are important for salmon recovery, maintaining genetic diversity of Atlantic salmon populations over time given their really small population size, increasing the number of reproducing adults through the conservation hatchery program that the Fish and Wildlife Service runs, increasing the number of reproducing adults through the freshwater production of smolts, increasing Atlantic salmon survival by improving our understanding of marine ecosystems and the factors that affect salmon in the ocean, and collaborating with partners and involving interested parties in recovery efforts. Some innovative technologies include ways to improve stock assessments, tracking migration, survival and ecology, and advanced statistical modeling. Next slide, please. So the next species to focus a little bit more in on is the leatherback sea turtle. This is the largest turtle in the world. It's estimated that the global population has declined 40% over the last 3 generations. The primary threat to leatherbacks is bycatch and fishing gear. Additional threats include harvest of turtles and eggs, loss and degradation of nesting habitat, vessel strikes, pollution and marine debris, and climate change. Together with our partners, we're working on many efforts to conserve leatherback sea turtles. This includes things like exploring changes to fishing gear practices, protecting and monitoring nesting beaches, and eliminating the killing of turtles and the collection of their eggs. Because leatherback sea turtles are a global species, conservation and recovery efforts require international cooperation and agreements to ensure that the survival of these highly migratory animals occurs. And we work closely with many partners in several different countries across the globe to promote sea turtle conservation and recovery. And then last species to just spotlight a little bit in the next slide is white abalone. So commercial fishing has severely reduced white abalone numbers from historical levels. Surveys in Southern California show a 99% decrease in the number of white abalone since the 1970s. While there were once millions, the current population is only about 1,600 to 2,500 individuals. One well-studied population of white abalone in Southern California decreased by about 78% between 2002 and 2010, from about 15,000 individuals to just around 3,000. Commercial and recreational harvest of white abalone in California peaked in the 1970s. It decreased in the late 1970s and early 80s, and then it was closed in 1997. So now the most significant threat to white abalone recovery is low reproduction rates. And white abalone are also threatened by disease. Together with our partners, we've developed a captive breeding program to produce young abalone that can be reintroduced into the wild in the hopes of protecting white abalone from extinction. We've also begun experimental outplanting of white abalone to the wild. In November 2019, captive bred juvenile white abalone were released for the first time into coastal waters of Southern California. Since then, additional juveniles have been outplanted and monitored to assess their survival, movements, and growth over time. Next slide, please. So while the species in the spotlight have definitely benefited from a focused campaign to raise awareness regarding their status and threats, we also have some species that we call in the shadows. Species in the shadows are species that have received a lot less attention over the years. And we're using this 50th anniversary year to highlight them and help raise awareness about their status, threats, and efforts that we're undertaking to recover them. The species that are included in the Species in the Spotlight campaign are in the spotlight because we know enough about them to know what we need to do to save them. For the species in the shadows, we don't often have enough information to know what to do to recover them. These species include species like the North Pacific right whale, which you can see down in the bottom right. We don't know how many there are, where they go, what threats are impacting them the most, and other important information is lacking. Next slide. It's important that we use this anniversary as an opportunity to better engage the public and decision makers in what we're doing under the ESA. So this year we're highlighting our science and management efforts with regard to the ESA through things like web stories, site visits, podcasts, videos, and story maps. We're collaborating with partners in local communities. We're reaching out to national and regional media, sponsoring and participating in events such as species-specific days, which I'll share in a few minutes, a little bit more detail on that, doing some field work, and also awarding people who are doing a lot to help save these species. We're participating in various webinars like this one, and we're also publishing an internal newsletter. So I mentioned in the next slide that we are actually doing a bunch of events this year to highlight our work under the ESA. Some have already happened, and there are still a bunch to come this year. And I'll talk about a couple specifically, and you can go to the next slide, Lindsay. So in April, Janet Coy, Peter Thomas from the Marine Mammal Commission, and I were privileged enough to see a mother-calf pair of North Atlantic right whales when we went out with the Center for Coastal Studies team for the first ever North Atlantic Right Whale Day. We saw Medusa and her calf, and this was the calf was first sighted in December off the calving grounds off St. Catharines Sound in Georgia. Medusa is at least 42 years old, and this is her 7th documented calf. And if you want to learn more about the North Atlantic right whale moms and their calves, you can go to the QR code on the slide. There's a lot of information on each of the moms that calved this year and the information on their calves that we have. So next slide. In May, several OPR staff were lucky enough to go to Southern California and participate in some green sea turtle fieldwork with the Southwest Fisheries Science Center staff. We learned a lot about this very unique habitat area in Southern California and how the turtles are making use of it. And you can see in the middle picture a large green turtle with a tag on top of it to try to document and capture some video footage of where the turtle is going and what it's doing. Next slide. So we also, while we were out in California, went up to the San Gabriel River in Long Beach with some West Coast region staff, and we got to see some green turtles feasting in the flow that's near where sort of the more natural river meets the concrete structure that you can see in the photo. So this is a very highly urbanized environment. And you can see in the picture, if you look really carefully, a turtle head popping up there in the white water. They're sitting there and feasting on the plant detritus that's coming through. So it's pretty amazing to see a bunch of sea turtles apparently thriving in this really highly urbanized environment. Next slide, please. And we also had the opportunity to go with West Coast region staff to the Aquarium of the Pacific and learn more about their white abalone program. And we got to meet Myrtle, who is a very special white abalone. She's pictured in the photo on the left. If you want to learn more about Myrtle and why she's special, just ask Chris Yates or Melissa Newman about her. It's a pretty interesting story. Slide 25 is our next slide, Lindsay. Hopefully we're on track, okay. So another species we're trying to call special attention to this year is Rice's whale. And the reason why we really want to spotlight Rice's whale is there are only less than 100 individual Rice's whales remaining, likely lower than that. So this year we're working with the Smithsonian to highlight this endangered species at the National Museum of Natural History. They're going to be opening a new exhibit in October, and we're going to be holding a reception and symposium on Rice's whale in November. And while the focus is on Rice's whale, we'll also be including some information on North Atlantic and North Pacific right whales. So we'll be highlighting the ESA and the 50th anniversary in this exhibit. We'll be celebrating our partnership since we know that we can't recover Rice's whales or any other species without partners, and engaging with leadership, Congress, and other key stakeholders. Next slide. We're really excited about this new initiative called ASTER, and ASTER stands for the Advanced Sampling and Technology for Extinction Risk Reduction and Recovery. This initiative is focused on reducing extinction risk and supporting recovery of protected species through technological innovation. Through the use of new technologies, we can minimize some of the risk to species, as well as find new tools to gather more data and to fill in some of the important data gaps. And I'm going to walk through each of the different petals of ASTER. Next slide, please. So the first petal is artificial intelligence and machine learning. And these two tools will enable us to more easily and rapidly review available data to anticipate protected species presence and persistence in areas of risk to inform dynamic management decisions. For instance, we can use these tools to better understand patterns and the probability of North Atlantic right whale presence over time based on initial visual or acoustic detections. The next petal in the next slide is on uncrewed systems. And these systems enable us to monitor species non-invasively, which is important when you're talking about threatened and endangered species, and also in areas that are either difficult to access or even unsafe for people to access. So examples include drone footage of North Atlantic right whales to detect changes in health condition over time. So we can actually look down on them like you can see in the photo and look at past photo footage and see how they may be smaller than they have been in the past, shorter and thinner. Mark recapture photos by drones of Cook Inlet beluga whales are being used to estimate abundance and calf production. And short and long range aerial survey counts are being used to estimate pinniped abundance. And this is allowing us to transition from large scale ground counts of northern fur seal pups to UAS surveys. So next slide. Another petal is advanced statistical methods. The examples of advanced statistical methods that we're using for protected species include Bayesian hierarchical and or integrated likelihood models that are being used to estimate abundance and distribution over wide areas using covariates of different scales and types, or state space models for examining how habitat use may vary over time or in response to a seasonal variable such as sea ice. The next petal in the next slide is about acoustics and monitoring and quieting. Acoustic monitoring enables us to evaluate changes in species distribution from climate change, assess cumulative impacts range-wide for highly mobile species, track status and trends in baseline conditions, and detect presence of vocalizing species in near real time or in real time. Quieting techniques help to reduce anthropogenic noise impacts and threats to protected marine mammals, turtles, fish, and invertebrates. In the next slide, another petal is advanced sampling and omics, which provide opportunities to examine population structures, the health of individuals, and this can be done with small samples and minimal disturbance. They provide qualitative and quantitative data on presence, abundance, and the distribution of protected species. We can monitor and survey species where resources and circumstances are otherwise limiting. These tools allow us to time travel via historical perspectives on populations through previously collected water and other samples. And examples of that include eDNA and also advanced health sampling that we're able to do. So the final petal is on the next slide, it's for imagery. So multispectral imagery enables us to detect protected species in hard to survey habitats. For instance, we're actually able to discriminate among ice-associated seal species. We use remote cameras to monitor protected species populations continuously and non-invasively. Using remote cameras, we're able to monitor Steller sea lion seasonal distribution and vital rates at haul-out sites. High-resolution satellite imagery can be used to detect whales from space to aid in understanding shifts in distribution and habitat use. Electronic monitoring on fishing vessels enables us to document protected species bycatch, and this is particularly helpful in fisheries that are difficult to monitor using human observers. So next slide. As I said earlier, we know that we can't recover the over 160 species that are under our jurisdiction on our own. So we work with a lot of partners, and you can see here the logos of many of the partners that we've been working closely with. And these are partners that we have both here in the US and internationally. And our partners are vital to our success to recover these species under the ESA. Next slide. So you probably can't have a presentation talking about protected species without talking about climate change. Climate change is an existential threat, and the ESA is a tool to help ensure the protection of species and increase their resilience. Our best chance of success is to take actions that will ensure protected species and their habitats remain as integral parts of coastal and ocean ecosystems by enabling and enhancing their adaptation and resilience to climate change. We're working on creative and proactive ways of dealing with climate change and building adaptable and resilient protected species. And you can see here on this slide, this is a draft of a proposed approach that we're working on. We have a variety of tools and strategies that we're using to better understand and articulate the challenges posed to protected species from climate change. This includes things like climate vulnerability assessments, scenario planning, enhanced monitoring, developing new guidance and training, and striving to ensure that we're making climate-informed decisions regarding the recovery actions that we're taking. Next slide. So while the ESA is almost 50 years old, we've only just begun to figure out what it takes to recover many of these species. Many of our species, of our ESA listed species, are long-lived. Some species can live 100 years or more. Some of the work we're doing will take decades before we see species begin to recover. The ESA is more important than ever because it's a critical tool to help these animals, to help their ecosystems, and also to help the overall well-being of our planet to thrive. And that's our last slide, so I can turn it over to Shannon for some questions. And there's a QR code here that will take you to our webpage, so you can learn more about the ESA and the 50th anniversary. And just wanted to thank everyone for your attendance today.
Thank you so much, Kim. We have a couple of questions that have come in. If anyone else has questions or comments, we have plenty of time to get to them. So the first question we have is a two-part question. So what types of jobs in NOAA Fisheries are involved with the ESA, and are people who actually do the research to determine where the species is on the ESA spectrum?
So that's a great question. So there are a variety of jobs involved in the ESA. As I mentioned in the presentation, there are many different elements of the Act that we are charged with implementing. So we have Section 7 consultation biologists that work with action agencies, federal action agencies, to determine the impacts of their projects on ESA listed species and trying to minimize them. We have people working on listing new species and responding to petitions to list new species, designating critical habitat. We have people that work on recovery planning, both developing the recovery actions and then working with our partners to implement them. So there's a whole host of job possibilities working on the ESA. And while my office, the Office of Protected Resources, is primarily focused on the regulatory aspects of the ESA, the agency as a whole does a significant amount of research on ESA listed species primarily through our science centers. So there's a bunch of different research opportunities that are out there as well. So if you're interested in work in the ESA, definitely reach out to me or others that work in the protected resources offices and research components at the science centers throughout the agency.
And a follow-up question that we have, it looks like a couple of people have asked about this, so I'll try to combine those. We've heard that NOAA Fisheries are involved a lot in creating policy, but is NOAA also involved in enforcing those policies? And how does NOAA protect these species that are not in U.S. waters?
Okay, yes, so very good questions. So my office, the Office of Protected Resources, as I said, is regulatory. So we in order to try to help recover these species, we do take regulatory actions. And of course, those actions are only effective if we're able to enforce them. So we work very closely with the Office of Law Enforcement and other critical partners like the Coast Guard and things to help enforce the regulations that we're putting out. We do have several species, foreign species that I mentioned that we work on. We're not able to designate critical habitat for those species, but we are able to develop recovery actions that we identify as being important to help recover those species. And so we do work with partners on trying to help turn the tide for those species. And Angela Soma in the Office of Protected Resources is our go-to person on our international work for protected species. So you can reach out to her for more specific questions on that.
Awesome, thank you. The next question is, how have you used scenario planning to protect and recover listed species, and are you planning to use it in the future?
That's a great question. I actually am kind of excited about that question. I love scenario planning. I'm a big proponent of scenario planning. When I worked at Garfo, we actually undertook a scenario planning exercise for Atlantic salmon. And I had, when we did it, I had worked on Atlantic salmon for many years. And a lot of the time that we were spending kind of thinking about what we could do to recover Atlantic salmon was focused on the things that we really knew we had the ability to influence. And so it was focused on dams and passage issues. And when we undertook the scenario planning effort for Atlantic salmon, it really got us to think more broadly. Not that we didn't think about what was happening in the marine environment, but a lot of our time and attention was focused on those sort of the things that we had that were more tangible impacts that we could influence, like fish passage at dams. And so the scenario planning exercise, where we brought in a lot of people that didn't have just Atlantic salmon experience, they had a much wider array of expertise. We brought them to the table and started thinking about Atlantic salmon throughout their entire range and what we need to do. And it got us thinking much more broadly. We used that to go back and make some changes to the recovery plan that we were working on at the time for Atlantic salmon. And it really helped us to think about how everything is interrelated and how we could move forward in a more holistic way for Atlantic salmon. So it was a really good exercise. We've done Atlantic salmon, scenario planning for North Atlantic right whales, and there's been some other scenario planning exercises that have happened. It's a really valuable tool to think about what you can do in sort of the unknown future. So you come up with various scenarios that you think are plausible, and you look at what you would do under those scenarios, and you look across those scenarios to see, are there things you would do regardless of what the future looks like? So it's a really great tool. It's definitely a tool we're going to continue to use. We actually have scenario planning, and Dory Dick, who is out on she works for the Office of Protected Resources, but she's out on the West Coast, is a expert in scenario planning and has been vital to the development of the training that we're doing. So if you have more questions on that, she's definitely our go-to person on scenario planning.
Awesome, thank you. So NOAA Fisheries recently released an equity and environmental justice strategy. So in what ways has the listing process already incorporated environmental justice aspects? And just from your perspective, how do you think we can better engage with communities with this in mind?
So this is, just to double check that I understand the question, it's specifically about the listing process?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So when we undertake a process to determine whether or not a species should be listed or meets the definition of an endangered or threatened species, we conduct status reviews. And part of that is gathering all of the information that we know about a species and their status and threats to them. And so when we're engaging in that process, we try to make sure that we get as much information as we possibly can. The standard under the ESA is the best available information. So we try to rely on a variety of resources for that. We are the federal government, so we do have some constraints on how we can bring in information from external sources, but we do try to cast as wide a net as possible. I think we can do better at that, and I think our EEJ policy will help with that, trying to bring in perspectives. We do need to make sure that we're bringing in all sorts of knowledge, and it's not just the scientific information, but also traditional ecological knowledge is a really important aspect of understanding what's happening to the species, how they've changed over time, what the things are that are having the most significant impacts on them. So I do think trying to broaden the scope of our ability to gather information is really important in the listing process. Obviously, sticking with what we're able to do as the federal government, but it is an important aspect of it.
Awesome, thank you. The next question that we have is, does NOAA engage internationally to protect endangered and threatened species outside of the United States? And if so, which species does it do work on?
So yes, is the short answer to that. We engage internationally on a lot of species. I'm most familiar with what we're doing for Atlantic salmon. I'm the head of the U.S. delegation to NASCO for the United States. And that NASCO is the North Atlantic Salmon Conservation Organization. So it's comprised of 7 parties across the North Atlantic working to address risks to Atlantic salmon throughout their entire range. So we have that. We have the International Whaling Commission. Angie Soma is our point person on CITES, which I mentioned earlier, which looks at international trade in animals and plants that are endangered. There's a whole bunch of different conventions that the U.S. is party to that help to protect endangered and threatened species internationally.
Great. All right. The last question we have, there is some love for the ESA 50th anniversary logo that you have here, and someone's interested in maybe getting a sticker or something with that logo on it. So yeah, just wanted to share that this logo is very popular.
That's great to hear. We love it too. We have an awesome graphics person that created that for us. And it's technically called an identifier. It's not a logo. We have to be careful what we call it. We can definitely share that. We also have a really cool background for that you can put behind you on Google Chats. So we have that available too. So yeah, reach out to OPR staff, Rachel Hager, Lindsay Stadler, all the folks in OPR have access to our identifier and to that background. So you can use that whenever you want.
Awesome. That sounds great. I might do that myself. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions come in. So with that, we can sign off a little bit early.